Welcome to the New Horizons small group for the first Sunday of March, March the 1st. This Sunday we are beginning a new quarter. Last quarter we looked at Matthew chapters 1 through 13. This quarter we're going to be looking at Matthew chapters 14 through 28. We're using the Explore the Bible curriculum, and this morning we're in Matthew chapter 14. It's session number 1 for the quarter, and it's entitled Courage. So, Explore the Bible curriculum, Matthew chapters 14 to 28 this quarter. This is session 1 entitled Courage, and we're in Matthew chapter 14. Since we are starting a new quarter, let's take a minute and just talk about the book and kind of summarize what we found out in chapters 1 to 13, and then we'll pick up with chapter 14 here in a few minutes. So, to begin with, Matthew is one of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels that tell the story of the birth, ministry, arrest, trial, resurrection, death, resurrection, ascension into heaven. It's basically the biography of Jesus Christ. Matthew's, though, is written with a particular bent. In fact, all 4 of the Gospels are written with a particular theme, a particular notion in mind. In the case of Matthew, Matthew serves as a transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He talks about Jesus to an audience that was predominantly Jewish, and he talks a lot about the prophecies of the Old Testament and how Jesus fulfilled them. That was one of his primary themes. Now, as we look at the book of Matthew, we find that Matthew was somewhat of an unusual selection to be an apostle. He was one of 2 apostles who wrote biographies or gospels of Jesus. One was Matthew, the other one was John. But Matthew was kind of an odd choice because Matthew was a tax collector. He was someone who worked for the Roman government, the oppressors of the Jewish nation. And tax collectors were known to be notoriously crooked. They would steal money. They would charge more taxes than the Roman government required, and they'd keep the remainder, which meant that they got rich. In the first half of Matthew, chapters 1 through 13, we talked a lot about Matthew's view of what happened with Jesus in the Galilean ministry, the Galilean portion of his ministry. The book starts off talking about his genealogy, which ties him to the Old Testament, talks about the wise men, his baptism, John the Baptist in his ministry, talks about the temptation, and then it gets into his ministry, and it focuses on 3 parts of Jesus' ministry: his preaching, his teaching, and his healing. So as we go through chapters 14 through 28, we're going to take a slightly different bend. So the first 13 chapters are in Galilee. And as we begin chapter 14, Jesus is going to start to move downward. He's pointing towards Jerusalem and to Holy Week. And we'll reach that later on this quarter. But the title of the day's session is Courage. So the opposite of courage is fear. So fear is a very powerful foe. It's something that hinders people from making progress in life. In fact, some fears can be so bad that they're called phobias. And those phobias can have dramatic impact on people's lives. So let's talk about some common phobias for a minute. I've listed, it looks like 7 or 8 common phobias. These are ones that people generally know about. How many do you know? So let's start with the first one. Acrophobia. Anybody know what that one is? It's the fear of heights. And I can sympathize with that. I don't have acrophobia, but I don't feel comfortable on heights. Second one is aerophobia. Now, that one you should get. Aero, think of airplane. Aerophobia is the fear of flying. Arachnophobia. We've all seen the horror movies of the spiders, so arachnophobia is a fear of spiders. Claustrophobia, fear of tight places. I don't like to be closed in. Here's one you may not know. Glossophobia. Anybody got a guess? Glossophobia. It's the fear of public speaking. Guess I don't have that one. Mysophobia, fear of germs. You ever know somebody that washes their hands obsessively? They may have mysophobia, a fear of germs. And then nyctophobia, fear of the dark. Now those are fairly common. Here are some not so common phobias. I've never heard of them, so you probably haven't either, but let's look at a couple of them. The first one is omphalobia. O-M-P-H-A-L-O, phobia. Omphalobia. It's fear of belly buttons. You ever know anybody afraid of belly buttons? I sure haven't. How about podophobia? Podophobia, think podiatrist. It's a fear of feet. Scoliophobia. I know a lot of kids that have this one. Scoliophobia is the fear of school. Plutophobia, fear of money. I hope none of you have this one. Ablutotophobia. Think ablution, bathing. It's a fear of bathing. Ergophobia, fear of work. And last one is pyrophobia. Think papyrus. It's the fear of paper. Hopefully none of us have any of those fears bad enough to be phobias, but many of those we might have a little bit of reaction to at one time or other in their lives. So today we're going to look at fear, and we're going to look at courage. So as we begin Matthew chapter 4 and look at Matthew chapter 14, we're going to start looking at Jesus' progression towards Jerusalem. So what's happened previous to this? Well, up until chapter 4, it's been discussion of his birth and John the Baptist, his baptism, and his temptation. Beginning in chapter 5 and going through chapter 8, Matthew focuses on Jesus' teaching. So think 5 through 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. So it's a heavy theme of Jesus' teachings. Beginning in Matthew 8 and going through Matthew 10, we see Jesus' miracles, his healing miracles. And in Matthew 11 through Matthew 18, lapping over into this quarter, we find the different reactions that people had to it. The Pharisees, the common people, the synagogue leaders, how they reacted to what Jesus' miracles and his teachings had done. And then as we get to chapter 14 and going forward, we find that Jesus begins to withdraw or attempt to withdraw from the crowds and taking his disciples with him in order to instruct them as to what will happen after he's gone, because he knows he's facing the cross. In fact, he's beginning to point himself towards Jerusalem and Holy Week. And as he goes, he's teaching his disciples, okay, guys, this is what you're going to have to do to be able to complete the mission that I'm giving you. So as we begin, today we're in chapter 14, and let's take a quick look at what's happening in chapter 14 before we get into today's session. So chapter 14, in my book, my Bible, verses 1 through 12 is entitled John the Baptist Beheaded. Now we know back from chapter 4, Matthew 4, that John the Baptist had been arrested. He had dared to call out Herod Antipas for his relationship with his brother's wife, and he had been arrested. And now in chapter 14, we find that he has been beheaded. He has been killed. Beginning in verse 13, my Bible says, when Jesus heard what had happened to John the Baptist, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Idea being, I need time to assimilate. I needed time to think about this. I also need time alone to my disciples. Well, he doesn't get it. Because beginning in 13 and going through 21, we have the feeding of the 5,000 men plus women and children. So he does the feeding, another miracle, and we pick up today with verse 22. So let's look at Matthew 14, verses 22 to 27, and let's set the scene for our story today. 22 to 27. In the NIV, it says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. So let's take a look at what it says in the NIV, in the Holman. That was the NIV I just read. So here's the Holman, verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. Matthew likes the word immediately. He uses it throughout his gospel. Almost everything that Jesus does begins with immediately. There's no waiting. In fact, in the story we're going to read today, Jesus uses the word immediately 3 times. Here's the first one. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. Well, the word made here is a very compulsory word. It's a word that indicates compulsion. You don't have a choice. Get in the boat and go to the other side. Now, why did he do that? Well, Matthew doesn't tell us. But if you go over to John's Gospel, in John chapter 6, John talks about the reaction of the crowd to Jesus feeding the 5,000 men plus women and children. They are so amazed that they want to proclaim him Messiah, and they want to basically revolt against the Roman government and make him king. And this is not what Jesus wants. So in order so the disciples don't get caught up in the frenzy of the crowd, Jesus sends them on a boat and sends them to the other side. Now, where on the other side? Again, Matthew doesn't tell us. But the feeding of the 5,000 takes place on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So they're proceeding to the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And then Jesus dismisses the crowds. So verse 23, after dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Again, Matthew doesn't tell us the name of the mountain. It's not important. It's not germane to what Matthew is trying to tell in his gospel. What is important here is that Jesus went up there alone. Says it 2 times. He says he went up on the mountain by himself. When evening came, he was there alone. So he's up on the mountain by himself. He wanted solitude in order to have time to think about what had happened to John the Baptist, think about where his ministry is going, and think about what's going to happen in the future, to be strengthened by his Father. So now the scene shifts. We've got Jesus up on the mountainside praying, and now the scene is going to shift to the boats. Verses 24 and 25. But the boat was already over a mile from land, Now, depending on your translation and which gospel you're using, it can be over a mile from land. John's gospel says they were 3 or 4 miles from land. Regardless, they were far enough away from the shore that the winds coming off the mountains surrounding the Sea of Galilee were kicking up a storm. And they were being battered by the winds because the wind was against them. They were trying to tack into the wind to get to the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And around 3 in the morning, or depending on your translation, it may have said during the 4th watch of the morning, which had been between 3 and 6, but early in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the sea, or again, depending on your translation, walking on the lake. Now, it's important to know that there's a mythology about the Sea of Galilee that says that the spirits of the sailors who have died on the lake inhabit the lake, and at night they come out and circulate around the surface of the water. So these were seasoned fishermen. They would not have been particularly afraid at this point about sinking the boat. They were having a hard time moving the boat across the lake. They were probably tired. They'd gotten on the boat at sunset. Now it's almost sunrise. They've been fighting the weather, trying to get to the other side, and they haven't made it yet. They're tired. They're hungry. They're wet. And all of a sudden, off in the distance, they see a figure walking towards them on the surface of the water. Is it a ghost? Well, let's look at verse 26 and see what their response is. Verse 26 says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. So what kind of reaction did they have when they saw Jesus coming towards them? First off, they were terrified. Now, terrified here refers to both physical and mental anguish. They were scared out of their wits because they thought this may be a ghost coming. They thought they saw a ghost. Remember the mythology. Ghosts flew around the surface of the water at night. And then lastly, they cried out in fear. Superstition was getting the best of them. They were not expecting Jesus to walk across the water to the boat. Verse 27. Immediately, okay, second time Matthew's used the word immediately. Immediately, Jesus said to them, have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. So Jesus tells them 3 things here. First off, he says, have courage. Jesus many times said to people, have courage. If you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, when angels or divine beings appeared, many, many, many times, if not every time, the personage had to say to the viewer, don't be afraid, it's okay. So Jesus follows script. Have courage. Secondly, he said, it is I, which kind of harkens back to Yahweh. I am. And then lastly, he says again, don't be afraid. Fear is a normal reaction when you see divinity. So they are very much afraid, and Jesus is calming their minds and telling them, it's okay, it's just me. Now, let's look at verses 28 to 30 and see what happens next. So, keep the picture in mind. There's a storm on the water. The boat's being tossed about. Sailors are fighting the wind. They look off in the distance, and here's this person walking towards them on the water. And they're afraid. And Jesus says, don't worry, guys, it's just me. So what happens next? Verses 28 to 30 in the NIV. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Okay, let's take a look at the Holman version now. Verse 28, Lord, if it's you, Peter answered him. Well, this is, if you will, a story within a story, because the only gospel that talks about Peter walking on the water, or Jesus walking on the water, is this one. Mark, Luke, and John do not have this story. They have the feeding of the 5,000, but they don't have the story of Jesus walking on the water and Peter getting out of the boat. So this is a story in a story only told in Matthew. Now, there's some debate over what Peter meant when he said Lord. I mean, the word itself can mean multiple things. It can simply mean like sir, address of respect. But notice what he says next. Command me to come to you on the water. Well, it sounds more like something more than just respect to whoever he's calling Lord. Because in order for Peter to walk on the water, it would take divine intervention. And the construction of if it's you is conditional, but it's conditional with the expected answer is, it is you. So since it says if it's you, if your translation says since it's you, it's probably closer. Peter is basically saying, okay, Jesus, you say it's you. If it's you, and I think it is, then command me to come to you on the water. Verse 29, Jesus answered him in one word. Come, he said. Now notice, Peter asked for a command. Jesus gives him a command. Come. And climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came towards Jesus. So the apostle asked for the command. He got it. And he gets out of the boat. And that took a little courage right there. Can you imagine trying to step out of a boat onto a roaring sea, expecting to drown? But my master, who I think is divine, has commanded me to come, and I'm getting out of the boat, and I'm going to walk towards him. Now, how far did he get? Matthew doesn't tell us. And we don't know how far away Jesus was from the boat. But whatever the interval is, Peter does get close enough for Jesus to touch him. We'll get to that here in a minute. Look at verse 30. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid. Now, you can't see the wind, but you can definitely see the effects of the wind. So Peter has gotten out of the boat. He's taken, I would assume, several steps towards Jesus, and then he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and he looks around. And here are whitecaps and waves, and I'm kind of assuming thunder and lightning and a storm around him. And he's no longer looking at Jesus, he's looking at his circumstances. And he's beginning to sink, because he's taken his eyes off Jesus. But notice who he calls for help. Lord, save me. He knows who's in control, and he knows who it is that has the power to save him. So Peter says, Lord, save me. You have control over this. Verses 31 to 33, and we'll finish the chapter. In the NIV it says, immediately Jesus reached out with his hand and caught him. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, and when the men of the place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the hem of his garment. And all who touched him were healed. Okay, we're only going to look at a portion of that. So let's take a look at 31 to 33. That ends the story of Peter walking on the water. beginning 31, again notice immediately. Third time in the story, Matthew has used it. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught hold of him. So Peter got close enough to Jesus for Jesus to reach out and grab his hand or grab his coat, get hold of him to keep him from sinking, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Only after Jesus had rescued him, only after Jesus had gotten hold of his hand and pulled him out of the sinking water, did he rebuke Peter for his lack of faith. The word here for doubt is a word for a divided mind. So think of it as you had the mind to walk to me, now you have the mind to be scared and sink. Which mind has priority? Verse 32, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Jesus didn't say a word. Peter and Jesus gets into the boat. The storm's over. Then those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, it happened once before, if you remember. Jesus was on a boat in a storm, and he awoke because the disciples were afraid of the storm, and he simply said, "Peace, be still," and the storm ceased. This time he didn't even say that. He got into the boat, the wind and the storm ceased, and in verse 34, a little bit later, then they get to their side. They've been fighting all night to get there. The storm ceased. They are there. Then those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, the previous episode with the storm in the boat, they said, "What kind of man is this?" Now they are acknowledging that this is in fact divinity. This is God himself. As good Jews, they would have known that the only person worthy of worship was God himself, Yahweh Almighty, God Almighty. So to worship Jesus means they are acknowledging him as God Almighty. These miracles of nature that Matthew details are not just to show how strong Jesus was. They were to meet a need. In the first episode with the boat on the Sea of Galilee, it was to quiet the storm. This time it's to quiet the storm. Everything Jesus did was for a tangible response to a desperate moment. Jesus is there when we call on him. Think of the Apostle Peter. He was watching Jesus, was doing fine. He took his eye off Jesus, he began to sink. But Jesus was there to save him, to rescue him. The same thing applies to believers today. The situation may be desperate, but we're not walking through it alone. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day. Thank you for the lesson that says that you are always with us no matter what's going on. May we take that to heart. May we know that you are there to rescue us from sinking whenever it is that we need it. May we move forward in faith that we can do anything through the strength that you give us. Be with Patrick as he brings your message this morning. May it be something that touches our hearts. For we ask it in your name. Amen.